the only place I can ever think of too high agreeableness and too high conscientiousness hurting you is in psychopathology.
Welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley, joined as usual by Elon Martin and Adam Daniels. Today, we are joined by Sandra Brown. Sandra is the author of just 2 books. Do I have all of your books here, Sandra? I've got first
no,
one.
12.
No, there's more. 12 books. So many books I was not aware of. Well, we've got 2 of them here, not all 12. But we've got How to Spot a Dangerous Man Before You Get Involved from 2005. So that one's almost 20 years old. And then I've got the second edition of Women Who Live Psychopaths from 2009. But you've got a third edition that I hope that we'll be able to talk about. I don't have that one yet, so
Yeah.
You'll tell me all the reasons why I need to get it right away and read it. So Sandra is a former psychotherapist, and I want you to just tell our audience what you do now and what you've been doing recently, because I should just give a little bit of background. We've known each other for many years. We did some podcasts together back, I don't know, was it 15 years ago? But we haven't really been in touch since then. So we just recently got back in touch on Substack. So I'm interested in hearing what you've been up to, Sandra. So let us know what you've been doing since you're not doing psychotherapy, right?
Not if I can help it. Well, let's see. The third edition of the Psychopath book came out in 2018. And before that, I hooked up with Purdue University to do a research project on the women who end up in relationships with narcissists, antisocials, and psychopaths, to see if there was any commonality that might serve as prevention work. And so that took a couple years with Purdue, and then that information went into the third edition of the Psychopath book. And then the Psychopath book ended up going into a therapist training program. So we have trained 12,000 therapists over the last year. So that was 10 years from Purdue to developing the therapist training thing was 10 years. So I've had my head down.
I'm just curious, Sandra, do you know off the top of your head how many therapists there are in the United States? Like, do you have any idea what the numbers would be?
Yeah, I just looked that up, actually. Almost 200,000.
Okay. So that's a good chunk of the therapeutic demographic.
6%.
Yeah. Would you say, are most of those or all of them American or multiple countries?
No, all over the world.
All over. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask a bit about the books and the new edition. So, well, let's start with How to Spot a Dangerous Man. What was the purpose in writing this book, and what about your views have changed? What would you say about this book now, so many years after writing it?
Yeah. I wrote that book because at the time I was running some groups in a domestic violence shelter, and the one particular person had been in 6 or 7 times, and I went to pull her file, out of the file cabinet. It was, like this thick. And so I just said to her in group, clearly you're not getting what you need in order to not get in these relationships, do you have any idea, what it is that we failed at and teaching you? And she said, I guess you need to teach me how to spot a dangerous man before I get involved. And so I said, I can do that. And I went home and, publishing is sort of like, winning the lottery. I went home, I wrote, I sent out 10 publishers, and in a week I had sold that book. And that never happens, in publishing, unless you already have a big, name and career. So that book did really, really well in the media. They like the sound bites of 8 dangerous man types. And it was written because I think that, and it was written for women, that women only understand dangerousness as it pertains to physical and sexual violence. But someone that's dangerous to our well-being can be emotional or psychological, sexual, financial, spiritual. And their concept was so narrow. And I also think they did not consider, for instance, choosing not to date someone who had some chronic form of mental illness. And it was like a taboo thing that I shouldn't judge that person. And so many of these women were in relationships with people who had profound amounts of mental health problems. And, I got a lot of crap on that book too, from people who are very NAMI oriented, the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, because I spoke very openly about the forms of mental health that you shouldn't date, or addictions, or, and I just put it out there and said it. So, the book did well and did well in the media, but there were a lot of people that thought that was very judgmental.
Do you think that, so how have your thoughts about the subject changed over the years, if any?
Yeah. So, I don't know if I would write that book today. So that book is 18 years old now, and I've had, quite a few more years of treatment, etc. It did well in the media because there were identifiable red flags for each.
A list.
Yes, kind of thing. And I just don't think it's that easy. I think in identifying people's problems, first of all, they hide them really well, especially if you're dealing with psychopaths or narcissists. That's not always, easily identified early in a relationship. And so I just think humans are more complex than how I first identified it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the pop psychology articles that you see online, that, like 10 signs that your boss is a psychopath or something like that, right? Right. So let's get into a bit of that complexity, because you're still you're training therapists. You still have this kind of drive about kind of public education about these topics. So how do you incorporate the complexity into those types of endeavors?
I've dropped it back to what the DSM talks about in terms of 4 key universal impairments, for instance, in personality disorders. So, and I think those four key elements, two have to do with interpersonal skills, which is a low or no empathy and emotional intimacy. And then the other two have to do with the disordered person with self-identity and self-direction. And so instead of taking Dr. Robert Hare's TCLR list that has, forget how many items on it, 26 or 30 or something. Yeah. It's a much quicker route because probably the first things that people will pick up on is the empathy and intimacy issue. So what we teach therapists, of course, is much more detailed, but for the public, for them to be able to begin at that issue about empathy and intimacy as sort of the early red flags. So we've just tried to make it easier than taking 8 dangerous men and all these red flags, and that those 4 core impairments are in all personality disorders.
So in a sense that you've, like, on the one hand, you found that the issue is more complex than you presented it, but on the other hand, you found a way of kind of simplifying it and narrowing it down for that purpose.
Well, I mean, as far as the why people end up getting in the relationships, how I approached that in the Dangerous Man book was pretty what I would call nurture theory oriented. You know, what how they were raised or environment. And since the study that we did with Purdue, studying the actual personalities of people who end up in these relationships, that was sort of the wake-up call about this is more complex than just you had a bad childhood.
Well, let's get into that. So describe the Purdue study. Like, how did that come about and what did it involve and what were the results?
Yeah. So in the first and second edition of the Psychopath book, I had done this small study using what's called the TCI, or the Temperament Character Inventory, on a small amount of women, 75 women. And I sent the results to the creator of the TCI, Dr. Cloninger. And we had some conversations about that in which he said the consistency of it was really interesting and that I should go deeper. He said, you usually don't see sort of across the board the same types of outcomes. They're usually sort of all over the place. So I, not technically, you know, a researcher. I'm just a systems kind of thinker. So I started knocking on doors, just, you know, calling universities, and no one told me you don't really do that. That's not how you get. So I just did. And Purdue, in their personality lab, they usually study personality disorders, and that end of the spectrum, psychopathy and personality disorders. So this coming in with relatively normal women that might have some traits a little bit over the bell curve was interesting to them because they always have their nose stuck in psychopathy. And so they offered to do it. And we ended up testing over 600 women. So it was a pretty big study, and the outcomes were like identical to what I had used earlier in the TCI. And the guy from Purdue said the same thing. You never see this across the board with not much variation. He said you might see it in psychopaths, but you don't see it in like normal people. But I said, how often in your lab do you even study normal people? And he said, that's true. Yeah. So, so anyway, the interesting thing on their personality assessment was that all of their traits were a little bit elevated, but there were two that were significant that I think played into the relational dynamics. One is the trait of that's called agreeableness. Mm-hmm. And within that trait are facets that make up a trait. And those facets included things like empathy, compassion, tolerance, trust. Mm-hmm. And the other trait was the trait of conscientiousness. And so those are kind of stick with it kind of people. And so when we look at, there's all sorts of assumptions about how people end up in relationships, with psychopaths. And for the most part, it was the wrong kinds of assumptions. Everyone thinks they'll see them coming. They all come marked like Charlie Manson with the swastika between their eyes, when in reality they fly under the radar. And so in looking at that, the trait of agreeableness helped us understand targeting, who personality disorders or psychopaths would like, empathetic, trusting, cooperative kinds of people. So it explained a lot about how they were targeted and how they entered the relationship. And then the trait of conscientiousness with the stick-to-itness of that was the difficulty about disengagement and why, for a lot of them, they were in these relationships for decades.
Yeah. That makes me wonder if, because it makes sense to me that would be basically a trait that the psychopath is looking for, like, in his prey, essentially, finding that agreeable person. I wonder if that is the trait they're specifically looking for, and it's just the conscientious women that end up sticking around. Like, do you think it might be possible that they go after agreeable women, but if the woman isn't agreeable, she might just leave the relationship? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So, when I did, work with psychopaths a million years ago, and had them in group, I asked them, how do you target? And they said they will what they call play the empathy card. And that, if they approach somebody at a cocktail party and lead the conversation into their sad childhood, their recent divorce, that they can't see the kids, that wife has taken the kids, and the person says, good luck with that. Sorry about your luck. Good luck with that. I'm going to go get some hors d'oeuvres. He's shot. But if she answers, oh my God, that I can't imagine that, and let me give you my therapist's phone number, and I just read the best book, and they reply with this, level of empathy. And so the interesting thing was to see that I don't know if we really think about this a lot with personality, except in psychopathology. What a little bit too much of something, how that can become a risk factor. And so, these having too much empathy. And the interesting thing about the trust that is part of that facet is that these people tended to have blind trust. as opposed to people that don't have too much agreeableness have conditional trust. I don't know you from Adam, and you earn, my trust over a period of time. Mm-hmm. But with these people who have too much empathy, it's like they hand out their credit card of trust. I don't know you from Adam, and I'll wait for you to violate my trust. But being conscientious, also having that higher conscientious, that violation of trust had to happen hundreds of times because of their stick-to-itness. And so it just, Purdue said, this is like the perfect storm, that they had these two trait elevations, and then knowing what the trait highs and lows are of psychopaths and personality disorder, he said it was like the perfect storm for those to hook up.
And it's almost like puzzle pieces, because psychopaths are extremely low in agreeableness, of course, the most disagreeable, and unless they're pretending, and I'd say probably the majority of them are low in conscientiousness.
Yeah.
So
they're
that's an interesting mix.
Yeah. So when you talk about opposites attract, I don't know that I would say that about the women, because they were targeted and,
well, and they were manipulated too. It's like the psychopath isn't presenting himself as a disagreeable, lazy schlum, right?
Right. And so they are complete opposites. And that's where like that trait of conscientiousness begins to carry that relationship. Finding a counselor for them or going to couples counseling, because they are so conscientious that they do double duty, which, psychopaths absolutely need.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the 12,000 therapists that you helped train, because on your websites, it says that you have a different approach in a couple of respects to how therapy is conducted. And you make a couple of distinctions. One of them is that you don't want the client to necessarily be repeating the story as they understand it over and over again. That there's another kind of approach that may be more healing or therapeutic to them than, this is what happened to me, something that might be repeated in group sessions more conventionally. Yeah. And I was wondering if you might talk about that in general, and any other, another thing that I found very interesting was that you had, I think, a neurophysiologist or who was also assisting you with this work, which suggested that there were actually brain changes incurred in clients. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh my goodness, that speaks to a whole other level of therapy.
Right. So during the 10 years when I had my head down, researching, one of the things that I started to study was that I am trained in trauma, and before this work, I worked a lot with people who had personality disorders, and a lot of them also had trauma. So I am trauma trained. And, what was interesting to me was that these survivors coming out of these pathological relationships had a different kind of like neurocognitive impact. It was so much worse than just a trauma-only client, which is having treated, PTSD, there was something different about this neurocognitive impact when survivors had been, especially, with psychopaths and antisocials. And I guess in retrospect, we should expect that what a psychopath or an antisocial can do to you psychologically is more. But we thought that was all just on the emotional level. And so a lot of my study had been looking at why their neurocognitive condition was so much worse than just someone who had PTSD, but not from a psychopath or an antisocial. And so there's some unique things that happen with these survivors. And one of my theories in this that came out in the third edition of the book was about this impact of cognitive dissonance. And this happened to sort of tie into those traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness. And it turned out the more that I studied why their cognitive dissonance was so severe, it is connected to elevated traits of conscientiousness. So these women who already had high conscientiousness were at more risk of developing cognitive dissonance. And so cognitive dissonance in those relationships is like, I love, I loathe, I want, I don't want them, I trust them, I don't trust them. And it explained why, a little bit about why their neurocognitive condition was so bad, because 75% of them have trauma from these relationships. And now they have this other factor of cognitive dissonance. And the more that I began to study that, I looked at fMRIs that cognitive dissonance can even be mapped in the brain. And so it creates hyperneural activity, a firestorm of comparing I love, I loathe, I want, I don't want, and which is part of why their neurocognitive condition was so severe.
And I would imagine also that the cognitive dissonance presents in all, in many different contexts, not just in the language that they use to describe their relationships, that it has an overall effect in their thinking ability in general.
Absolutely.
It's like brain damage.
So I dug deeper again, like back to the drawing board, and started looking at all the things that cognitive dissonance can impact, which has to do with executive functioning. So these, my clients, what didn't compute for me is that my clients were attorneys, doctors. In order to function at that level and that job, you have to have really good executive functioning skills. And so many of these people were going on disability and taking leave absences because they couldn't balance their checkbook. They couldn't make a decision. I had a surgeon, who couldn't do surgery because of that. And so I began to look at everything that trauma and cognitive dissonance can affect, and it began to reduce their executive functioning, like decision-making, rational judgment. And so it also explained why these relationships went on for decades when these are really bright people, that could not, get their decision-making and rationale working enough to make the decision to leave. And so we began to really see this as a neurocognitive condition, which is why when you said that we have this principle about not just sitting in therapy telling the story over and over again.
Yeah, thanks for coming back to that.
Inflames the cognitive dissonance, it inflames the trauma. And so very much their early needs are very neurocognitive, trying to get the brain working again before you can even work on therapy.
Oh, wow. Huh. So, not inflaming the brain in repeating, the experiences and the narrative of the trauma. Is there a counter therapy to that? Is any part of the talking therapy better formed or better presented or structured, might be a better word, in helping them to come to terms with their story?
Right. So there is a time and place where we do that. It's just not in early treatment because of the neurocognitive approaches or condition. And so I think I just don't see it out there anymore. Of course, I was trained in the 1990 in trauma treatment by Bessel van der Kolk. I mean, a million years ago. And what was really big back then was this process of stabilization. And you just don't see it in treatment anymore. And so I'm old school, and, I thought, I bet that would be very helpful with these survivors who have such neurocognitive. They're so triggered, you can't get anywhere near their storyline without, setting off more trauma and cognitive dissonance. I mean, so I thought, well, we can't just run at it, with trauma treatment. These are people that need old school sort of stabilization about learning how to, work with a lot of the trauma symptoms, especially the neurocognitive stuff. So we kind of work with the brain early and wait for some of that to stabilize and for the cognitive dissonance to reduce and get a better handle on triggering before we jump right into the storyline.
Do you find with, well, I'll give a little bit of background. I just got a copy of, well, as you know, I write the political punerology Substack. So, and Lobachevsky, the author of that, he wrote a couple other books that weren't published or that weren't translated into English. And so I just got a copy of one of his Polish books. And it's called Word Surgery, and it's his book on psychotherapy. And he's got chapters on dealing with people under the influence of psychopaths, and kind of related topics. And so just I was going through and just putting random paragraphs into DeepL to translate and just see some of the ideas in there. And one of the things he said, I can't, this is just by memory, so I might get the details a bit wrong, but he was talking about the relationship, about people in a relationship with psychopaths. I think he was talking about women specifically, but it might have been more general. And he said that, one of the first stages, I can't remember what the first stage that he mentioned was, but then he used then he said, then comes what he called decriterialization, which I have no idea what that means, but I think it might relate to what you were talking about with the cognitive dissonance. Because it sounds kind of like losing your criteria, losing your standards for what's going on, and your ability to kind of like think rationally and see the world rationally. That's the kind of what I got out of that. But then he said, the last thing he mentioned was kind of coming to this awareness, like you're being kind of stalked by demons, like there's something in your life that's just like you're doing battle with something. And so he kind of contrasted that with the first, like the initial situation where I guess you're kind of just under the spell. Yeah. So with some of these women, does it get to the point where with some of them where they come to that realization like on their own and they struggle with that? Or do you see any kind of stages like in the development of how they approach these relationships?
In getting into them or getting out of them?
Well, both, because there are some that, haven't gotten to that stage of getting out yet, right? So what is it that brings them to the point of getting out?
Well, a lot of it is exactly what you just said. There is, I would say, the vast majority of them indicates some spiritual sense of evil. And they all say, I don't care whether they're agnostics or that, and they always want me to write about that soul tearing and that spiritual, what is that ookiness kind of stuff. And so that is a big part of it. And then for a lot of people, it is the decline in their neurocognitive condition that becomes so disconcerting. Yeah, they just are so scared about their neurocognitive condition. And then the internet, has been very helpful with being able to just Google, what some of these people's behaviors are. And, a lot more information now that's available. So it's, usually it is the beginning of the cognitive dissonance that makes them go out and start Googling that words and actions don't match. Or there's some thread that gets pulled, and all of a sudden you find this hidden history and hidden life and some loose thread, or the women call it when the mask slips. So when they actually see the other side of, the mask.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to get back to about how your thoughts kind of changed with the studies. So you said, first of all, you originally were kind of approaching it from the kind of nature or from the nurture environment perspective. So that might be like, to use the Purdue study as an example, it would be like saying, oh, well, or a previous way of looking at it might have been, well, these women probably got in these relationships because they learned from an early age, blah, blah, blah. And, but what you found in the study is that, well, all these women actually had some things that were in common. It's like what you're actually finding is the women who are predisposed to this kind of, to getting it, or to being trapped in this kind of relationship. Because it's not like every woman who's highly agreeable and highly conscientious will get into a relationship with a psychopath. There probably aren't that many psychopaths to pair up, equally in numbers. I hope not. But so there's this tension. So from that perspective, it might be a matter of targeting, doing a different kind of targeting of these women, targeting these women and saying, look, you've got the traits that kind of can create a dangerous situation, right? So do you think that there's a value in targeting women with those specific personality traits? And how do you see that tied into like an overall framework of just a general education about, cluster B or personality disorders or psychopaths in general?
Right. Well, as we've complained about for years, we have poor public pathology education. The good thing that did happen with the Dangerous Man book is that book has been used in middle schools and high schools, women's prison systems. I mean, that's, even though it's to me now sort of simplistic, it's a good primer, at least getting people to understand, personality disorders. But as far as, a big campaign, if you will, those are risk factors for sure. But until, the that public pathology education gets some kind of funding in order to do that, we limp along with survivors finding the information after the fact, except for, wherever the book has been, used. But I mean, part of what we also look at, not with Purdue, but just in our client base, is that this, higher trait of agreeableness does translate into career choices. Nurses, therapists, teachers.
Yep.
And so there, if there was a way to reach through career choice, when
those networks.
Or when they're in nursing school, how here's your proclivity and your personality. It's all great. You're a warm, loving person, but there are a couple risk factors. And that's what Purdue said. He said, with these women's trait elevations, he said, the only place I can ever think of too high agreeableness and too high conscientiousness hurting you is in psychopathology. That's it. He said, these make the most wonderful friends, employers, employees. So the only thing that, we had talked about was how to get that information into certain career paths.
Yeah. No, that sounds like a great idea. I hadn't even thought of that.
And that, if I can jump in for a second, that, because I watched an interview that you did a couple of years ago where you were talking about, what is super traits, and you were kind of like, you were describing all of the things that you've talked about here, where, like you say, these high agreeableness and high conscientiousness can be really great things, but then they also come with a risk factor. And something that you had said later on was one of the biggest aha moments from some of the women that you would help treat. Some of the biggest aha moments came from showing them the neuroscience, getting them to understand the actual, getting them past the point of rationalization, getting them out of their little
fantasy
loopholes. Yeah, their little fantasies.
He can change, right? Neuroscience, God bless neuroscience. It changed completely how we approach. And no matter how they could come into our agency, if they were coming in through counseling, if they were reading the book, if they're in our online course, if we're training therapists, we teach neuroscience and neurobiology of personality disorders and psychopathy to everyone. So in any form, it has been our best friend for breaking through that cognitive dissonance. Well, he's bad, but maybe he can change. Kind of thing. And that neuroscience, I hated using the neuroscience when they would come here for retreats because they were all puddles on the floor at the end of the neuroscience, because it was so much reality. It was just busted through any kind of defense mechanism. It was the best thing. And I teach the therapist too. Use this brain then and use it. I'm telling you, it'll cut a year off therapy.
Wow. Do you also incorporate, do you mention statistics? Because that just brought to mind one of the other things that Lobachevsky recommended. In his practice, he said that he thought it was a really good idea to tell his patients who are in relationships like this, well, first to describe the different types of psychopathologies, to show them that, well, this is an actual thing here, like we know what this is here. It's an actual thing here. Look at this. But then also to bring up the statistics in the sense of, like, this might be for a child of a psychopath, or a child of like a mother with borderline personality disorder or something, and to kind of reassure them that, well, this is actually a small minority of the population. It's like, you shouldn't go around thinking that 99% of the population are like this. Basically, to help them regain the capacity to trust other people, because a lot of these people didn't have trust. They couldn't trust other people, and it let them. Well, if you find actually the majority of people, you could probably trust them to a much greater degree than you could trust your father, actually, or your mother. I'm just wondering if you have any of your own experience with that, with just describing
I mean,
demographics.
They come out of these relationships, of course, trusting no one. And, they, in our course, we have a monthly group call kind of thing. And they're like, I know my next door neighbor's a psychopath. And I also think my third grade teacher was, and now I see him everywhere. Well, that's a trauma response. That's still hyper arousal. That's still hyper vigilance with them seeing it everywhere when it's not everywhere. And so that starts to reduce, in trauma treatment, where that gets much more balanced. But most of them come out of that acting exactly like that, a psychopath behind every tree. But we do have to work with that blind trust thing. So, no, I don't.
Yeah, okay.
I don't say to them, it probably won't happen again, because if there's 30 people at a cocktail party and one psychopath, they're going to make a beeline to them. Mm-hmm. So we try to balance between vigilance. You have risk factors. You do need to know some things about yourself and your super traits, but also about pathology, and differentiating that from hypervigilance, which is a trauma response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe that it might be different for like for a parent-child relationship than it would be for an intimate relationship, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit, because we had the opportunity to have George Simon here a couple of years ago now, I think. And what I really appreciated about his book, Character Disturbance, was how he drills down and specifies, what is not only of a narcissistic character disturbed individual, and what that looks like and sounds like, and how it presents. But if I remember correctly, because it's a while since I read it, I think he also outlines some of the ways in which, basically normal, healthy, well-adjusted people behave and interact interpersonally. And I really appreciated that about the book. And what I was wondering is if there is any place in the therapy that women receive that presents models for healthy behavior and relationships, and if that is part of the like you're like almost like you're getting re-educated as to what a good relationship is.
Right. So our online course is a year long, and it is a trauma reduction and cognitive dissonance reduction program. After that first year, there is a second, what we call a second step program. And once their executive functioning is working, their trauma's down, their cognitive dissonance down, their brain works again. In the second year, we work with really coming to understand their super traits in their daily life, not just in their intimate life, and about learning how to become more familiar with how that trait of agreeableness would want to lead if they aren't paying attention. We call it chaperoning, paying attention to what your innate personality wants to do, and blind trust and too much empathy. So we spend time on that, and then we also work on healthy relationship stuff, dating with super traits. You know what? You're out with somebody. What are you going to do with that empathy? What are you going to do with that blind trust? What are you going to do with that? Yeah, and it's like they have to completely learn new ways of being, and that's hard because your personality is innate, and you have to be horribly conscious,
right?
Especially for them. And so yeah, that the second year, when the brain works better, we get into all that.
Yeah, it sounds like a course in metacognition almost. Like, okay, now I'm running my my empathy horses, and I can afford to take a step back here, and
we have to, and it is metacognition. What does empathy sound like in your head when you're getting ready to do something? You're on a date and he's giving you some storyline. What are you saying in your head? What's your body language? What kind of words come out of your mouth? So it's a lot of reworking that. And in the beginning, they just couldn't get it. I don't know if I wasn't describing it well. So the way I taught them was through the Golden Girls television show. So Rose is agreeable. And Dorothy is conscientious. And so I would say, okay, so we're talking about, you're going out on this date. Who's going? Are you letting Rose go on this date, or is Dorothy going on this date?
Right.
And and it's so funny, they could absolutely shift that thing. So, I don't.
That's great.
Well, that brings up an interesting point because, you bring up, basically a source of fiction and fictional characters who nonetheless represent certain characteristics or ways of being. That's their thing, and it's quite obvious and predictable in a sense whenever you see them to expect these types of behaviors. Because we've been reading novels of a romantic nature over the past few years as a kind of exercise in thinking about what relationships, healthy relationships, even among the narcissistically wounded, how they might evolve into something that is healthy and romantic and genuine and authentic. So, but it is through the lives of these characters that that's part of the exercise. You can't help but get a little identified with them and their struggles, and experience this happy ending. So I thought I'd just throw that in because, thank you for being a friend. Golden Girls, that's an interesting tool.
Yeah. Well, just trying to make it something identifiable for them. And I don't know if that works. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. They're just big words until you have something to, a picture in your mind that you can tie to it, right? So Golden Girls is perfect. But I want to, I think we've almost been going an hour, maybe, just a few more questions and then we'll call it a night. But I'm wondering, I'm sure, I haven't looked at the YouTube statistics lately, but I'm sure we have at least a few young, agreeable, conscientious women viewers and listeners to our podcast. At least fingers crossed. So, would you have any advice for like young women who might have these traits, who might be either just starting dating, or be in their 20s, or about to start, maybe about to get married or something like that? Any advice for them?
Well, the testing instrument that Purdue used was a 5-factor, the big 5, mm-hmm. which is, you can get it online and take it, yourself. And we tell women to do that, and again, personality science it's just now starting to really grow as a field. And I don't think we think about personality that much, or the risks of it. Most people only know, for instance, whether they're extroverted or introverted. And that's about it. That's about all they know about their personality. And so for women, I would say, take the big 5 and see, especially in looking at where you rank in agreeableness and conscientiousness. And if that is a risk factor, go by our website and learn some more about that, because there are things that you have to be conscious of. They make you a wonderful person who you are, but in certain people's hands, they are a weapon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can't, protect what you don't understand. I mean, at least now with our survivors, when they're going out, they become aware of certain things that need protection in them, and that trait of agreeableness. And like I said, they send Dorothy out on the date. They don't send Rose out. So, but there are things that survivors can learn about how to chaperone their own personality traits.
Just off the, I'm just curious if off the top of your head how high in agreeableness and conscientiousness, how high these women were. Like, was it like 85th percentile or 95th, or was there a range?
Well, the 5-factor is ranked from either 0 or 1 to 5.
Okay.
And it's a self-inventory thing. And these women tested 4 as a 4 in agreeableness and conscientiousness. 3 is sort of normal. 4 is right above the bell curve. 5, you're probably dependent personality disorder.
Yeah. Okay.
So if they take it online, if they're hitting a 4, they're in that high bell curve. Yeah. But as far as what was the percentage of the 600, I forget. He said it was so astronomically high. He had to run down the hall and show it to other people.
Was that study published, or was it more you just had the results and then you put them in your book?
First I had the results. He's just now, he had another big study after that. He's just now submitting them to peer-reviewed journals.
Okay.
So, personality journals and relationship journals. So I didn't have anything to do with that. I'm like, give me my data and then you can do, So, but he is pursuing that.
Okay. So for all of the number nerds, all of the arcane details will be in those papers, right? Yeah. It was, it was significant. Like I said,
not so high over the bell curve that they were up into dependent personality, but one toe over the line, enough to be at risk.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't thought about dependent personality in terms of agreeableness. That's interesting. What about avoidant personality? How would you characterize that on the Big Five? Anything off the top of your head?
High in neuroticism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to think about that.
Which I wish they used a different word, because when the women go and take that test, that sounds so judgmental, that word neuroticism. And actually what it is a measurement of anxiety. It's actually an anxiety scale.
Yeah, negative emotion in general. Yeah.
Just a quick question, because earlier and in your writings, you talk about women getting victimized in a number of different ways, psychologically, emotionally, financially, and you put in spiritually. And when you were talking about it a little earlier, if I understood correctly, you said that, these ladies, some of them might interpret the damage that they've received as a kind of evil, and which can be attributed to either the cognitive dissonance and not being able to determine what the heck it is, or possibly some other sense, maybe.
So they meant that in terms of they sensed evil in that person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so leading to that is my question, is there a place in therapy, you think, for prayer and religion and anything along those lines? Is that a part of?
I meet them where they're at. My undergraduate degree is in theology. So, if I have done that, especially when they have that sense of evil, that having had that experience of it, and that it feels like it is still present, and they want, some people use Reiki or energy clearing, or if
Smudging.
they want. Yeah, I've done prayer. People ask me to anoint them with oil.
You pretty much, you take you follow their lead, right?
Yeah, I don't introduce that. No, but it is not uncommon, because, like I said, one of their big issues is feeling that sense of evil, and then they get into all the stuff. That person has been inside my body, and then it becomes, it's a big issue.
Yeah. Well, it's getting dark. It might be time to call it a night. Sandra, where can people find your work? What websites and other places would you recommend?
If you're a survivor, you can go to saferelationshipsmagazine.com. If you are a therapist, you can go to survivortreatment.com.
Okay, and you've got your website too, which is sandralbrownma.com, I believe.
Yeah, I don't post a whole lot on there.
No?
Mostly
Okay.
just safe relationships and survivor treatment.
Okay, well, we'll put those links in the description of the podcast and the video so people can get there.
Great. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, Sandra.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, we'll do it again sometime. So take care. Good night, and we'll talk again later.